So look, welcome to this inaugural episode of Reality Check. It's a pleasure to have you on board our first episode. I want to get straight away, Danny, to a story you've told before, but which I think most Americans are completely unaware of. It's a story I love. I wrote about it in my book. And it's a story of how you were retained by Marcia Smith from the Congressional Research Service to do some work for President Jimmy Carter into the UAP issue. And before we get to the issue of what you were asked to do, just explain to me what you were told by Marcia Smith had happened when President Jimmy Carter asked to be briefed on the UAP mystery.
Right. Well, what happened, Ross, is that President Carter was elected like on November 4th of 1976. And right by the 19th of November, even before he'd been sworn in, one of the first things he did is he sent word to have the CIA director come down to Plains, Georgia, to his home and brief him personally at his home about the UFO issue and his potential relationship to any extraterrestrial civilization. It turns out that the CIA director at that time was George H.W. Bush, who was later to become president. But at that time, he had been appointed by the new president, Gerald Ford, who had just taken over from Nixon, having resigned due to the Watergate burglary scandal. And George H.W. Bush refused to give him the information. George Bush told him that as the elected president, he had no reason to know this information. He said that if, in fact, Carter was willing to keep him on as his CIA director so that he could become permanently the CIA director, that he might be willing to tell him about this. But President Carter did not. And so what President Carter did is instead he contacted the Congress and said, look, the Congress needs to be involved in this. And he asked the Science and Technology Committee of the House of Representatives to contact the Congressional Research Service and to have them produce two major reports for the president. One on the probabilities and likelihood of there being an extraterrestrial civilization. And secondly, whether it might be responsible for at least some of these sightings of the UFOs. And I was contacted by Marcia Smith, who was the director of the Congressional Research Service, Science and Technology Division, and asked to become special counsel to that investigation because I was at the Jesuit National Headquarters. I was their general counsel in their social ministry office, which was their public policy office.
So can I just take you then very quickly to what happened? I'm going to tell this in a rough, quick form. As I understood it, you insisted on being given access to the hitherto secret unreleased Project Blue Book files. And incredibly, they agreed to do that. You were given access because this was a presidential fiat. And as a result of that, and I took great pleasure the other day, I was walking back from a bar near Congress, and I stood at the Madison building, the very same building where you were given entry before it was even officially opened. Tell me what happened that day when you went to the Madison building in the National Archives. What happened?
Well, what happened is Marcia Smith had told me that I had to bring two forms of official photo ID. So I brought my Washington, D.C. driver's license and I brought my passport. And I came to the building. I was surprised that nobody had even occupied the building yet. It was brand new. It had just gotten built. And there were these two suits standing outside of the door waiting for me. They demanded to see both forms of my identification, and I showed them both, and then they showed me in. So I went into the hallway, and they said, go down the hallway to the right, and you'll see an elevator there on the left. And you go down into the basement, and you'll see the place to go. So I went in, I got in the elevator, and I went down. And as I was going down the elevator, on instinct, I just opened up my briefcase and took out a yellow pad and slipped it under my arm, and then closed my briefcase. The elevator arrived in the basement. I got out, and it was dark down there. There weren't lights on, but I could see down the hall. I could see a light coming out of a room, and there were these two other suits, these guys, big kind of husky-looking guys that were there. So I go down the hallway, They both demanded, both of them demanded to see my two forms of identification. It was sort of like they resented my even being there. But I showed them, and they said, "Look, leave that briefcase here. You can't take any notes. You can't record anything. But here the stuff is. They brought the stuff for you." And so I put the briefcase down. Yes.
So I just want to set the scene for this. This is you, Daniel Sheehan, being given access to the darkest, deepest secrets in the American military-industrial complex. You've asked for and been given access to the UFO files, the secret files of Project Blue Book, the files the government denies exists. What did you find?
Well, what I did is I walked in, and I was in this a comparatively small room. It was about maybe 20 feet wide and about 12 feet or so deep. And there were these three big cardboard fold-out tables, and they had like shoeboxes, these little light green kind of government green shoeboxes with the little ties on them. And there was a microfiche machine that was there. And so I sat down. And I took the yellow pad out and I slid it over behind one of the boxes so that if they looked in, they wouldn't see it. And I opened up the first box, and they had these little film canisters of microfiche film. So I took the first one out and I put it into this old-timey microfiche machine and started cranking it and looking at it. It was all these documents. And I said, I don't know how long they're going to allow me to stay in here. And so I said, if I start reading each one of these documents as a lawyer, it's going to take forever. So I sort of cranked through them to see if there were any photographs anywhere. Nothing was there in the first canister. And so I folded it all up and put it back in. And I opened up a second canister, went through it, and they had a lot of documents again. I could see all the official stamps on them and the top secret designations, et cetera. And then I got to the third canister, I think it was, and partway in, there it was. Here was this series of photographs. Black and white photographs of a crashed flying saucer. There wasn't any doubt about what it was. It was a winter scene. There was snow on the ground, and the saucer, it was a classic large disc saucer, about 40, 50 feet across, with a big dome on the top of it. And it had hit into this snow-covered field, and it plowed this big ditch all the way across the field, like the earth was all turned up, and it was stuck into the side of this big snow-covered embankment, stuck in there like at a 45-degree angle, just stuck in the side of the hill. And I could see all around it, there were these Air Force personnel. They were in winter jackets, with the big fur around the hood, and they were taking photographs of it. And I actually saw one of the guys in one of the photos. There were like three of them that I saw the photos, and they had one of these old-timey cameras, a movie camera, like with the two big round canisters on the top of them. So it must have been like in like the late 40s or early 50s or something, I figured. And so and then all of a sudden I realized that in one of the photos I could see around the bottom of the dome of the crash saucer that was stuck in the embankment, these symbols. And I looked at them and I said, wow, look at those. There's nothing like anything I've ever seen. They're not Russian. They're not Chinese. They're not, hieroglyphics. They're totally unique. So I said, okay, I'm going to trace these because I want to make sure they're absolutely identical to what is there and that they're in the exact sequence that they're in. And so I did is I took out the yellow.
These are top secret files, Danny. Isn't that an act of espionage?
Well, no, I'd been cleared to see them. And so what I did is I took out the yellow pad, and interestingly enough, it's just one of those instinctive things. I opened up the yellow pad to the inside cardboard backing. And what I did is I pushed the backing underneath the microfiche machine and then focused the microfiche right onto the inside cover of the yellow pad so that I traced them identically, absolutely, totally accurately, every single one of them. And there must have been about 8 or 10 of them that were all obvious. So I traced them in detail, and I got them all done. I kept looking up to see if anybody was watching. And so I got it all done, and I closed the yellow pad, and I said, that's it. I got it. That's a UFO, man. And look, it's got all these unique symbols on them. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the stuff away. I put the little microfiche away, put it back in the box, took the yellow pad, stood up and put it under my arm. You know, I have my suit on, and I didn't put it inside my suit to try to hide it. I just stuck it under my arm. And I turned around and got up and walked out. I walked right straight out the door. And the two guys were kind of surprised. And I'm surprised and I think about it that I left as soon as I did, but I had the information. And I said, I don't want to take any chances at all. So I left. I went out the door and I reached down and picked up my briefcase that was sitting there by the side. And I started walking down the hall. And all of a sudden, one of the guys said, hold it. Hey, hold it. And I stopped and he said, what is that you got there? And I said, oh, that's my briefcase. I just picked my briefcase up, which was there. He said, no, under your arm. What's under your arm there? They both of them came over to me and kind of loomed over me. And one of them reached over and yanked the yellow pad away from me and then ruffled through all the yellow pages. And there was nothing on them, of course. And then he kind of grumpily handed it back to me. And so I put it back under my arm and just turned around, picked up my briefcase and started walking down the hall. I hope I wasn't whistling. To try to get. But
for people who don't know, Danny Sheehan obtained degrees from Harvard University and Harvard Law School, and he's a huge advocate for UFO disclosure and transparency. This is something that we want to talk about here. Now,
I would just like to add, Danny is almost, in my opinion, a legend on so many issues. He goes way beyond just the UFO UAP issue. He was involved in the Karen Silkwood case. He was involved. He actually has some background with the Daniel Ellsberg Pentagon Papers case of 50 years ago. He is an absolute expert on the Iran-Contra affair. And when I mean expert, I mean genuine expert. He was deeply involved in that and so many other cases. Native American rights. He's been a huge civil rights advocate for them. And I mean, there's almost nothing that he hasn't handled. And now, for many years, he's been engaged in the UFO UAP issue. And you've got a really interesting story of his to relate. So I'm just going to let you take it from here.
No problem. So Danny stated that in 1977, he was given a one-time only special security clearance that allowed him to see some off-site classified documents at the Library of Congress. However, it wasn't the building that we're familiar with. It's the one nearby. So I want to go to the actual building. This is the James Madison Memorial Building where all this went down here. So just want to get a picture of that building. Now, the placement of this is interesting so that everybody knows where this actually is. So if you look at the center of this photograph, you've got the United States Capitol. If we go off to the right, you've got the Library of Congress. And then the building that Danny went into is below that. That's that Madison building. That's where he saw what I want to describe here. So
with the red indicator there.
Correct. Yeah, that's correct. So I just want to give everyone a sight picture where all this went down. Now, he mentioned that when he got into this facility, of course, there was a security guard there. This is at the bottom basement of the Madison building. And he walks in, he has a notepad with him. You're not allowed to take photographs. He was checked. And then these files, from what Danny told me, were brought from off-site into the basement of the Madison building. So he goes over to one of these microfilm readers, and I'm going to go to the next slide here. And this is what he said he was doing, loading in these microfilm readers. They had this projection device where you could project an image down onto a white plate glass type device. And that's kind of what we want to talk about because that's mission critical to this entire case here. And this is the best I could come up with for one of these vintage 1970s, you could call it microfilm readers. And
yeah,
so
I remember them.
He thread that through the wheel, connected everything up, turned this thing on, and then he took his notepad and he was looking through this reel here, and he came across what he said were 3 photographs that depicted a UFO crash retrieval scene in the operation. This was a winter type application. This is a winter operation. There were 4 men wearing winter parkas. They had their hoods on. There was a furry flange that wrapped around the outer portion of their hood. They had cameras. There were 3 people with still cameras, and one off to the left that had a vintage I'm calling it 1948 to 1966 dual reel shoulder mounted motion picture film camera. So that's the sight picture. They're looking at this crash retrieval operation. This
Before you
dish-shaped
continue,
craft.
Michael, before you
Yep.
continue, I just would like to ask and
Go
have you
ahead.
reiterate the records that Danny was looking at.
Right.
Now, it's been a little while since I've gotten a story from him. I did hear you discuss it briefly on your channel. But these were, this is before Project Blue Book files were made available to the general public, I believe. This is 1976, early 77.
Oh, we know that Project Blue Book was canceled in 1969, and then those files were eventually brought to the National Archives.
Yes, but that was
Yes.
A little bit later. That did not happen right away.
Correct. That's correct.
So
That is correct.
now, but was Danny going through Blue Book files, or was he going
I
through
don't believe these are Blue Book files. No, this is something else that was brought from offsite.
So he was somehow able to get access to these
Yes.
for reasons which maybe are not 100% clear.
That is correct. That is
Okay.
correct.
I just
Yes.
wanted to make sure. So these were UFO, we'll say UFO because that's what everyone would said at the time. He had access to some UFO data that he was allowed to get access to.
That
at
is
this
correct.
location.
That is correct.
I want to be
And
clear about that.
he said there were about 3 photos there. One of these photos depict a crash retrieval scene with about a 25 to 30 foot diameter dish-shaped craft that was tipped up at a 30-degree angle. You had 4 people around it at various positions, and it had a low-rise dome on top. At the very bottom of that low-rise dome were these very interesting hieroglyphic type inscriptions wrapped around the outer portion of that low-rise dome. And when this thing came in, it had kind of augured a debris trail, and then there was a mound built up where this thing came to a halt. So he's looking at all of this, and he's thinking, you know, photographs are not allowed, and I'm going to go through what he actually saw here. And so the question is, what did this thing look like? What did this thing actually look like? So I met with Danny. This is about a month and a half ago. I was there with Rudy. We had a nice little meal here, and I said, please, Danny, describe to us what you saw. And so he drew this on a napkin, and Rudy was right with us. So he immediately started sketching, and we started vetting out these details. Again, when this thing came in, there was this mound on the right-hand side. And so you can see this is the beginning process of where we started this whole thing. Now, on the upper left are what Danny recalls as being these strange inscriptions or writings that was seen around the bottom of the dome. Now, I've got at least probably 7 other cases within the Stringfield files that also have these strange hieroglyphic type lettering. So, Richard, what I'm thinking is, throughout the decades, there's got to be this transnational team of linguistic experts, of engineers who are cataloging these symbols, putting this into a database and trying to decipher what these are. There has to be a team that's doing this.
It actually doesn't look truly like hieroglyphics in the Egyptian style. It does look a little bit like cuneiform, which is ancient Sumerian, but it's obviously different from that. It almost looks mathematical to me, like fractions.
Sort of, it does. Sort of, it does. All right, so these are the breakdowns here. Craft measured approximately 30 feet in diameter and was tipped up at a 30-degree angle. That was critical. Craft had a dome on top with what appeared to be strange symbols along its lower surface. That was the lower part of the dome. It left a trail on the ground, created a mound of dirt where it came to rest. The photo depicted 4 men wearing winter parkas with a furry fringe around their hoods. He mentioned he could see that in the photograph. So that was the viewing perspective here. And this is the key element here. 3 men had still cameras. A 4th man had a vintage shoulder-mounted double-reel motion picture film camera. He mentioned this very detailed. Using the motion picture camera as a guide, it appears that the photo was taken between 1948 and 1961. Richard, this is the best date that I could come up with. Now, I don't know the exact date. I don't think Danny knew either, and there was no indication where this was. So this is the best I could come up with, using that film reel camera as a guide for the date.
Yeah, so I'm assuming that style of motion picture camera was kind of out of favor by 1961?
Something like that, yes. They had moved away from that.
Yeah, okay.
That's correct, that's correct. All right, let's continue on here. Now, this was what these men were wearing. They were absolutely, all of them had this winter parka with this, what he said was a visible furry flange wrapped around the outer portion of that hood section. He mentioned that, so he could see that within that photograph. Something that I think the men were using were these still cameras. I don't think he didn't mention anything about a zoom lens, but these are standard issue, perhaps military cameras for the period correct time frame. And then one of these gentlemen, I've got the tripod here. He didn't mention there was a tripod, but I'm just showing what that top section of that motion picture film camera had. And it absolutely had those dual reels, Richard. This is what Danny had
Interesting.
mentioned. Yep, let's continue on here. So this is a blow up of what Danny drew for the inscriptions. I agree, it does look like cuneiform clay tablet type inscriptions. So I thought that was interesting. This was on the lower portion of that upper dome. And then really the refining process began. And this took some time. This was not easy to pin down here. So this is kind of our rough sketching, getting the layout of this correct. And this went on for like 3 weeks between Danny, myself, and Rudy, trying to get this perspective down. And we didn't get it right the first time. You can see this is our perspective. That top view is about a 75-degree 80 look down view. The one on the lower is more of a, I would say, 20-degree look down view. We'll go to the next one. Now you can see the placement of the men in the view. We've got the mount off to the right, so we're getting a little bit closer here. We'll go on to the next one. The angle here is about correct, but the problem is we don't have the orientation of the scene from the perspective that Danny said that he saw it on this microfilm reel. So that was the difficult part to pin down here. I'm going to go to the next slide. So now we're getting a little bit closer, but what we really want to do is take the entire scene and rotate it counterclockwise 90 degrees, which will get us a little bit closer here. We've got the men in place, and now we're starting to get closer. This is getting very close. When I sent this to Danny, he said, yep, this is getting very close. We've got the perspective now. So I said, okay, Rudy, we want to seal this in. We'll lock it down in concrete, but I want you to make one change. I want you to take that craft, which is at a 45-degree angle, drop it down about 15 degrees so that we're at 30. And this is, Richard, the final result that we came up with. And when we showed this to Danny, he said, that's about as close as you're going to get until you actually see the real photograph.
First of all, it's beautifully rendered. And wow, I'm just so impressed.
So something out here, Richard, there is a photograph of this, multiple photographs. So somehow we all need to run this to ground and find out where this happened, when this happened, who was involved, and what happened to the craft.
Yeah, we can assume it's probably an American retrieval since it was in a U.S. repository. You indicate between 1948 and 1961, so basically that sometime in the 1950s, most likely.
Yep, that sounds correct.
And in terms of the scenery itself, I mean, this looks like it's out in the middle of maybe the western states. It looks like we've got a large empty kind of plain here, which there's some mountains. Did Danny describe mountains in the background?
Maybe just low rolling hills, but he did describe this debris trail that this thing left. So it had augured out kind of a trough or pushed away some of the soil, but then when it came to a rest, it built up that on the other side of the craft itself.
So almost like it slid into the ground and dragged
slid into the ground
a little bit. And that might be why it was embedded at an angle, because it had just opened up so much earth.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay.